He thought he was just a poor mechanic, until he confessed his true identity at their wedding. The rain was soft but steady, enough to blur the edges of the morning. Olivia gripped the steering wheel as her car lurched forward, then stalled completely in the middle of an unfamiliar residential street. She groaned, hit the hazard lights, and checked her phone. No signal. Of course. She stepped out, pulling her coat tighter. The neighborhood was quiet. Neatly trimmed hedges, closed windows, no one around. She scanned the street, hoping for a gas station, a garage, anything. Then she heard the faint sound of metal clinking nearby. Following the noise, she turned down a side street and saw a man crouched beside an old red sedan. An elderly woman stood under a polka-dot umbrella, watching him with a soft, familiar fondness. The man worked silently, arms streaked with grease, his gray t-shirt damp with rain. There was something grounded about him, steady, deliberate. "Excuse me," Olivia called, approaching. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but my car just died back there. I think it's the engine, or something." The woman smiled. "You're lucky. Brian here's one of the good ones. Helped me more times than I can count." Brian stood, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked to be in his early 30s, with damp hair sticking to his forehead and calm brown eyes that didn't waver when he met her gaze. "I'll take a look," he said simply. He grabbed a toolkit from the car trunk and followed her back without asking questions. Olivia walked beside him, aware of his quiet presence, not cold, just intentional. Within minutes, Brian had the hood of her car open, sleeves rolled, brows furrowed in concentration. Rain fell harder, but he barely reacted. Olivia watched, struck by the ease in his movements, the way he handled each tool like an extension of himself. "Alternator's weak," he said finally. "I adjusted it so you'll make it where you're going, but you'll need it replaced soon. It won't hold long." "You fixed it that fast?" Olivia asked, stunned. Brian nodded, already wiping his hands. "Temporary fix, but it'll get you there." "Thank you, really. Let me pay you for your time." He shook his head. "You don't owe me anything." "No, I insist," she said, reaching into her purse. "You just saved my morning." "I don't do this for tips," he said gently. "Just check your brakes every couple of months. Don't let your car be more important than you are." Something in his tone, firm, kind, made her pause. She nodded. He handed her a small, oil-smudged card. Written in neat handwriting were a name, a phone number, and two simple words. Garage 47. "Thank you," Olivia said softly. Brian just nodded and turned back toward the woman under the umbrella, who gave Olivia a knowing smile. Back in her car, the engine started on the first try. She sat for a moment, watching the rain bead on the windshield. The card rested on her lap. There was no website, no business slogan, just a name, a number, and something she could not name. Something that felt different. That night she found herself reading the card again. Garage 47. She tucked it into her purse, though she was not sure why. 3 days later, she drove across town to an address she had traced from the number. The shop was tucked between a laundromat and a diner, with a crooked sign and wind chimes made from spark plugs. The open bays smelled of oil and metal. Brian was there, kneeling beside a truck tightening a bolt. His shirt was streaked with fresh grease. When he looked up and saw her, he didn't look surprised. He smiled faintly. "Car trouble again?" he asked. Olivia shook her head. "Not this time. I just wanted to say thank you. Properly." And for the first time in a while, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Over the weeks that followed, Olivia found herself returning to Garage 47 more often than her car required. Sometimes she brought coffee, sometimes pastries, once even a homemade sandwich that she insisted was too much for one lunch, but somehow always ended up in Brian's hands. He never asked questions, never pushed. He simply greeted her with that quiet smile and always made time to talk, even if it was just for 5 minutes between brake pads and oil changes. They began sharing things, not just about cars, but about life. Olivia spoke about her job in marketing and how it often felt like running in place, with a smile. Brian listened, occasionally offering thoughtful responses, but mostly just being present, which was more than she was used to. He told her little about himself, mostly stories from the garage or his old neighborhood, but Olivia did not press. It was enough, somehow, to just exist in the same quiet spaces. Brian lived simply. His clothes were plain, mostly faded from wear. His apartment above the garage was modest, neat, and filled with things that clearly held personal value. Old tools from his father, black and white photographs, dog-eared books. He never bragged, never talked about money, and never acted like he wanted to impress anyone. Instead, he spent his days fixing what was broken and his nights helping others fix theirs. Olivia soon learned that Brian often repaired cars for the elderly in the neighborhood without charging a cent. He even ran a small, unofficial check-in list for single moms who could not afford maintenance, showing up on weekends to top off fluids, replace wipers, or rotate tires. "Why do you do it?" she asked him once, genuinely curious. He shrugged, wiping grease from his knuckles. "Because I can. Some people need their car to work just to survive. It costs me time, not character." Those words stayed with her. It was not just what he did, it was how he did it, quietly, without recognition. Olivia had dated successful men before, lawyers, entrepreneurs, one guy who had a private jet. But none of them had ever looked at her the way Brian did when she was explaining why she hated Monday mornings, or listened to her favorite childhood memory like it was the most important thing he'd ever heard. For the first time in a long while, she felt safe, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually. She could breathe around him. The real turning point came when Olivia mentioned, almost offhandedly, how her mother's kitchen was falling apart. Her mother lived in a small, aging house on the edge of town. The cabinets were warped, the sink leaked, and the floor tiles were coming loose. It had been on their someday list for years. Brian just nodded. 2 Saturdays later, he showed up at her mom's doorstep with a toolbox, plywood, and a smile. Olivia was stunned. "You're serious? Tell me where to start." It took 3 weekends. Olivia helped where she could, passing tools, sanding cabinets, fetching snacks. But it was Brian who did the heavy lifting. He stayed late, came early, and never once complained. He did not accept payment. He would not even let her mother cook him dinner in return. "This is my thank you," he said one evening, screwing in the last cabinet door, "for raising someone who makes Tuesday afternoons feel like Christmas morning." That night, as Brian packed up his tools and headed to his truck, Olivia's mother stood beside her in the doorway, watching him. She leaned in and whispered, "You should hold on to that one, sweetheart. Men like him don't come around twice." Olivia did not respond. She could not. Her throat was too tight, her heart too full. Later, as they stood in the driveway, Brian leaned against his truck, looking out at the quiet street. "You don't have to thank me," he said, almost reading her mind. "But I want to," she whispered. He turned to her, eyes soft beneath the streetlight glow. "Then just don't leave." And she did not. From that moment forward, Olivia knew something had shifted. This was no longer something casual. It was not about excitement or charm or even romance. It was about home. And somehow, without her noticing, she had found hers, in the calloused hands and steady silence of a man who never needed to be more than himself. It was supposed to be a simple surprise. Olivia had finished work early and picked up Brian's favorite cinnamon bread from the small bakery 2 blocks from Garage 47. She was smiling to herself as she walked up the gravel drive, the scent of grease and rain-soaked pavement oddly comforting after the day she had had. She wanted to see his face light up, hear his low laugh, feel the warmth she had grown so attached to over the past few months. But as she rounded the side of the garage toward the entrance, she stopped short. Brian was not alone. Standing just outside the open bay was a man in a black suit, tailored, expensive-looking. His shoes gleamed despite the dirt. His hair was cut short and styled with the precision of someone who likely never changed his own oil. His presence felt out of place, sharp and deliberate. Brian stood in front of him, arms crossed. His expression was unreadable, serious, controlled, but focused in a way Olivia had never seen. He nodded once, then glanced toward the alley where Olivia now stood frozen. Their eyes met. Brian's jaw twitched slightly. The man in the suit turned, but did not seem to recognize her. He handed Brian a sleek black briefcase, said something too quiet to hear, then turned on his heel and stepped into a black car idling at the curb. The vehicle glided away moments later, disappearing like a ghost. Brian looked back at Olivia. She blinked, forcing a small smile. "Hey," she said, voice thinner than she expected. He stepped forward slowly, almost too casually. "Hey, you're early." She held up the bakery bag. "Thought I'd surprise you." Brian nodded. "Let me just finish up here. I'll be up in a minute." Olivia nodded, kissed his cheek, and walked into the garage apartment above, the smile still pasted on her face. She did not ask about the man. She did not ask about the briefcase. Not yet. But the questions swirled. Something about the exchange, about the way Brian had stiffened when he saw her, unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. That night, as they sat across from each other eating takeout, she watched him more closely than usual. He was polite, affectionate even. But he was also distant, distracted. He checked his phone more than once and did not meet her eyes as often as he used to. When he stepped out to make a call, Olivia's heart raced with a guilt she could not silence. She was not normally the type to snoop, but tonight felt different. She walked quietly to the far corner of the apartment, where Brian often stored tools and odd supplies behind an old shelf. The briefcase sat just behind it, half tucked beneath a tarp. It was unlocked. Her breath caught as she slowly lifted the lid. Inside were neatly stacked bundles of cash, not hundreds, thousands, maybe tens of thousands, wrapped tightly, organized in rows, untouched. Olivia's blood turned cold. She backed away slowly, closed the lid, and stood staring at it in disbelief. This did not make sense. Nothing about Brian, his lifestyle, his behavior aligned with this. Unless it did. Her mind raced. The man in the suit. The evasiveness. The fact that she still knew almost nothing about his past. No family visits, no social media, no backstory he ever fully shared. The man who never asked for anything had just been handed a suitcase full of untraceable cash. Her thoughts spun darkly, wildly. Drugs? Laundering? Some underground network? Had she fallen for a man who was only pretending to be the good guy? She could not sleep. Every sound in the apartment made her jump. Brian returned an hour later, kissed her forehead, and lay down beside her. She lay rigid, staring at the ceiling, her mind screaming beneath the silence. By 3 a.m, she made her decision. She dressed quietly, careful not to wake him, stuffed her phone and keys into her bag, and slipped out the front door. She did not leave a note. She could not explain something she did not understand. She just ran. Back to her apartment, back to the questions, back to the fear that she had loved someone whose truth was built on lies. She blocked his number, deleted their photos, tried to forget the way his arms felt around her, the way his voice softened when he said her name. But none of it worked, because none of it had ever felt fake. And that, more than anything, terrified her the most. Olivia sat curled on Mia's couch, hands clenched around a steaming mug of tea she had barely touched. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her voice hoarse from whispering through everything that had happened. The briefcase, the man in the suit, the money, the silence. Mia listened without interrupting, then sat back and said carefully, "You're sure it was full of cash?" "I saw it," Olivia said. "It was open. It wasn't a guess." "And you don't think he could be involved in something? Not illegal? Like a business deal?" "I don't know. That's the problem. I thought I knew him, Mia. He fixes cars, gives free oil changes to old ladies, brings soup when I'm sick. But that man yesterday, and the way Brian looked when he saw me, it was like he was someone else." That night, they pulled out their laptops and started searching. They tried everything: Brian plus Garage 47, Brian plus local mechanic, Brian plus the phone number on the card. His last name, which he had only ever mentioned once. Public records, social media, background search tools. Nothing. There were no photos, no business licenses, no tax records tied to his name. It was like he did not exist. Mia leaned back, frowning. Okay, this is creepy, like actually creepy. No paper trail at all? That's not normal. Olivia stared at the screen, heart pounding. What if he's not even Brian? She whispered. What if the name is fake? What if everything he told me was part of some cover story? I mean, why else would he have that kind of money just lying around? Why is there no record of him anywhere? The more she thought about it, the worse it got. Every detail, his lack of social media, his reluctance to talk about the past, the fact that he lived alone above a garage, started to morph into something sinister. Had she missed signs? Had she let her guard down because he was kind, because he had soft eyes and calloused hands? And yet, the Brian she knew had never made her feel unsafe, never once. But maybe that was the trick. Maybe it was the perfect disguise. Across town, Brian sat alone in his apartment, staring at the wall where Olivia's coat used to hang. The briefcase was still there, untouched. She had not taken anything. She had just vanished. His calls went straight to voicemail. His messages were left undelivered, but never read. He had searched every place she might have gone, her office, the bookstore she loved, the little pier where she liked to sketch. Nothing, no note, no goodbye, only absence. He had replayed their last conversation 100 times, trying to find what he had. The shift in her eyes, the way her voice trembled. He had seen the moment the wall went up, but it had already been too late. He could not tell her. Not yet. Not when it would only bring more questions and comfort. Not when he was still trying to figure out how much of his past should stay buried and how much could be shared without unraveling everything. But now she was gone, and the silence was unbearable. He opened his laptop, fingers hovering over the keyboard, then began to type. Subject: I understand, Olivia. If you are reading this, thank you. I do not know where you are or what you are thinking, but I know you are scared. I felt it. I saw it. I caused it. I am sorry. The briefcase, it is not what you think. But I also know you have no reason to believe me now. You are right to want answers. You deserve them. And maybe I was wrong to wait. Maybe I was trying to protect something that needed to be broken open. If you never speak to me again, I will understand. But please, before you decide who I am, know this: I never lied to hurt you. I never touched your life to play with it. You were the first person who ever saw me without asking for more. You made me believe I could live honestly. If you are afraid, I will let you go. But if you are not, come back. I will show you everything. Brian, he hit send, knowing it might be the last thing she ever read from him. And then he sat in the quiet, surrounded by shadows of someone who once believed he was simply a good man with a wrench, and not someone hiding a past that could cost him everything, including her. The last person Olivia expected to see that Saturday morning was Brian. She had come to the community fundraiser out of obligation. A friend from work had invited her, and she had agreed just to be polite. She was not in the mood for cheerful music, colorful booths, or smiling volunteers. Her heart still ached in places she could not name. But as she wandered past rows of tables with raffles and bake sales, her eyes caught on a group of children gathered near a small tent labeled Rebuild. Volunteers were helping fit kids with prosthetic limbs, custom-painted, bright with stickers and superheroes. A boy in a wheelchair beamed as a young man helped him attach a new, vibrant red prosthetic arm. It was Brian. He was kneeling on the grass, focused, gentle, laughing softly as he adjusted the fit. He looked different somehow, lighter and heavier at the same time. There was something in his eyes that pulled at her in ways she did not want to feel again. He looked up and froze. Their eyes locked across the crowd. Olivia hesitated, breath catching. She could have turned and walked away. But she did not. Her feet moved before her mind did. Brian stood slowly as she approached. For a moment, neither of them said anything. "You look well," he said quietly. "So do you," she replied. There was another pause. Then Olivia spoke before she could lose her nerve. "Was it real?" Brian blinked. "What?" "What we had. Before the briefcase. Before the silence. Was it real? Or just part of some version of you I wasn't supposed to know about?" Brian looked down, hands in his pockets. "It was the only real thing I've had in years." "Then tell me the truth," she said, her voice firm. "Now." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Come with me." They drove in silence. Brian took her to the edge of town down a winding road that led to a modest single-story house surrounded by trees. It was quiet, unremarkable. Nothing about it screamed secret wealth or danger. Inside it was warm, filled with mismatched furniture and shelves lined with old books and framed letters. In the corner stood a table covered with documents, donor envelopes, and photos of smiling children from different parts of the country. "This is where the money goes," Brian said softly. "The briefcase, the trust." Olivia stepped closer, scanning the photos. Kids with new legs and arms, mothers holding thank you signs, clinics in rural towns with handmade banners. "I started it 5 years ago," he continued, "anonymous, quiet. I didn't want my name on it. I didn't want it to be about me." Her throat tightened. "Then why the garage? Why the secrecy?" He sat down on the edge of a worn couch and looked at her, finally meeting her eyes. "Because I was raised with money I never earned. Because I was told that helping people only mattered if your name was on the plaque. And I hated that. I wanted to know who I was without the noise, without the legacy. I chose the garage because it was honest. Because every fix, every smile, every scraped knuckle, it was mine, not inherited, not bought." Olivia swallowed hard. "And the man in the suit?" "My lawyer," Brian said. "The trust is managed under a different name. He brings cash withdrawals every quarter, enough to fund each branch of the project. I didn't want it traced back to me." There was silence for a moment. Then he added quietly, "I'm not a poor mechanic, Olivia, but I've never wanted to live off money I didn't earn. I've been trying to rebuild something, starting with myself." She sat beside him, her fingers brushing the edge of a photo. "You could have told me." "I wanted to. But by the time I realized you mattered more than the lie, it felt too late." Tears welled in Olivia's eyes, uninvited and persistent. "I left because I was scared," she whispered. "Not of you, of finding out I didn't really know the person I gave my heart to." Brian reached out, gently taking her hand. "I never wanted to be someone you had to figure out. I just wanted to be someone who was enough, without a title." "And maybe you are," Olivia said, voice trembling. "Maybe you always were." In that little house filled with quiet proof of who he really was, the space between them finally felt honest again. Not perfect, not easy, but true. The ride back from the small house was quiet, but this time it was not uncomfortable. Olivia sat beside Brian, staring out the window, her thoughts full, her heart softening with each mile. She no longer felt angry. What had replaced it was something far more humbling. Shame. Shame that she had assumed the worst about someone who had only ever shown her the best of himself. Brian had not begged her to stay. He had not tried to explain away her fears. He simply showed her the truth and let her decide what to do with it. When they reached the edge of town, he pulled over near the same street where they had first met, the same sidewalk where she had stood, helpless and flustered, with a broken car and a rain-slicked coat. He turned off the engine, resting his hands on the steering wheel for a moment. "If you want to walk away again," he said gently, "I won't stop you." Olivia turned to look at him. His eyes were steady, but there was a kind of quiet sorrow in them that hurt more than any accusation. "I'm not here to ask for anything," he continued, "not even your forgiveness. But if you do want to keep going, if you want to try again, then take my hand, like you did the first day we met." He reached out, not in desperation but in hope. Olivia looked down at his hand, rough, scarred, familiar. She took it without a word. They sat there for a while, hand in hand, listening to the wind whisper through the trees. A month passed. Slowly, gently, they rebuilt. Olivia returned to the garage, not just to bring coffee, but to sit nearby and sketch while Brian worked. They shared quiet lunches on the tailgate of his truck. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. Brian never pressed. He was just there, steady, patient, real. That steadiness was what allowed her heart to come back to life, bit by bit. One evening, Brian invited her to a charity gala hosted by his organization. It was a simple event in a repurposed barn outside the city, lit by string lights, with soft music and tables lined with handmade crafts and silent auction items. Olivia wore a navy dress, Brian a jacket, no tie, still boots. They looked like themselves, just more polished. As the night wound down, Brian took the stage. "Thank you all for being here," he began, voice calm and warm. "This project started quietly. I never wanted it to be about credit, but tonight I'd like to use this moment for something personal." Murmurs moved through the crowd. Olivia's breath caught. He looked at her directly. "The first time I met Olivia, she was stranded on the side of the road. Her car stalled, her face looking like the world had ended. She didn't ask for help, she apologized for needing it." Laughter fluttered around the room. "I gave her a note with the name Garage 47 and thought I'd never see her again, but she came back." He stepped off the stage and walked toward her, pulling something from his jacket pocket. When he reached her, he knelt, not grandly, just with quiet purpose. "Olivia, the first time I met you, your hands were shaking because your brakes were bad. Today, if your hands are shaking, let it be because you're nervous about forever, and let me hold them every day of it." He opened his hand. No ring, no box, just a folded piece of paper, the same kind as his old garage card. In the same handwriting it read, "Still Garage 47, still yours if you'll have me." Tears welled in her eyes as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered, "I've always been yours." They embraced as the room filled with soft applause and gentle music, holding each other under the glow of barn lights like they were finally exactly where they belonged. The garden behind the Hearts and Hands headquarters had been transformed into a quiet haven. Wildflowers lined the path, string lights hung between trees, and wooden chairs faced a small altar beneath an old oak tree. Olivia stood beneath it, her white dress catching the golden light. Her hair was tucked with lavender, no veil, no train, just a ribbon around her waist, soft and sincere. Brian stood across from her, gray vest and sleeves rolled, his smile steady. He looked like the man who had fixed her brakes, and somehow, also, the man who had healed her. The guests weren't executives or VIPs. They were people Brian had helped. An elderly woman with a walker, a boy with a new prosthetic arm, teenage mechanics, volunteers, people whose lives had been touched not by wealth, but by care. The ceremony began with honest vows. Olivia promised to listen, even in frustration. Brian promised to tell the truth, even when it was hard. They vowed to keep choosing each other, not for who they once were, but for who they were becoming. Then the officiant paused and turned to Brian. "Before I pronounce you husband and wife, Brian has something he'd like to say." Brian took Olivia's hands. "I never wanted this day to be about who I was. I wanted it to be about who we are, what we've built." He turned to the guests. "For most of you, I've been Brian the mechanic, the guy who fixed your car or forgot to bill you. But what many of you don't know is that I'm the founder of this organization, and I'm still the chairman of the board." A soft gasp spread through the crowd. "I kept it quiet because I needed to know who I was without the noise. I left a life of legacy and expectation to build something real. I wanted to serve without needing my name etched in stone." He looked back at Olivia. I didn't want you to love the man behind a title. I wanted you to love the hands that fixed your brakes, the heart that burned toast and got grease on your kitchen chair." Soft laughter rolled through the guests. "I wanted to be chosen, not for what I have, but for who I'm trying to be." He pulled a folded note from his pocket and read, "To the girl who made a mechanic feel like a king. You are the reason I found my way back to myself." The officiant smiled, voice warm. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Brian, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was slow and full of promise. As they turned to the crowd, hand in hand, Olivia whispered, "You never had to prove anything." Brian smiled. "Maybe not, but I needed you to know everything, and still stay. Always," she said. The rest of the afternoon was filled with laughter. Barefoot kids dancing in the grass, elders raising lemonade in toasts, and stories shared under the trees. Olivia looked around and saw the quiet legacy Brian had built, not with wealth, but with love. And as they walked past the rows of wildflowers and lanterns, she thought of the first day, when all he gave her was a card, Garage 47. And somehow, that had been more than enough. 1 year later, the life Brian and Olivia built together was not one of grand headlines or lavish travel, but of rhythm, purpose, and peace. They lived in a modest wooden house on the edge of town, tucked beneath a canopy of tall pines, and wrapped in the kind of quiet that let you hear birds before sunrise. It was the kind of home where the porch creaked when you stepped on it, and the windows fogged slightly in the morning, where everything felt lived in, warm and real. Brian still worked with his hands. He kept Garage 47 open on weekends, not because he needed the money, but because he loved the work. He fixed brakes for single moms, replaced radiators for old friends, and spent his Saturday mornings running free technical classes for teenagers who might not have had a father figure or a steady hand in their lives. Olivia opened a small interior design studio just down the road, a community-focused space where people from all walks of life could come and consult on how to turn small rooms into sanctuaries. Her favorite projects were the affordable ones: shelter spaces, single-bedroom apartments, the homes of quiet warriors just like Brian. She believed everyone deserved to live in beauty, even on a budget. Each evening, no matter how busy the day, they paused, they made tea, they sat on the porch or by the fireplace, depending on the weather, and read aloud thank you notes from people Brian had helped, handwritten letters, sometimes scribbled in awkward cursive, sometimes typed with precision, always heartfelt. One night, a letter came from a boy named Marcus who had attended one of Brian's free classes and was now enrolled in a technical college. Another came from a grandmother who said the car Brian had fixed allowed her to visit her late husband's grave every Sunday. Olivia saved every one of them, tucking them into a large box that sat under the coffee table. They never stopped being surprised by the kindness they had helped inspire. And though their world was simple, it was full of meaning, of joy, of each other. Their wedding photo hung above the mantel, framed in rustic oak, next to a small glass case that visitors often asked about. Inside it was the old black briefcase. It now sat empty, slightly scuffed at the corners but polished clean and locked shut. Resting atop it, mounted with a brass nameplate, was a small plaque that read, "It wasn't money that changed us. It was truth." People who knew the story would smile quietly when they read it. Others would ask. Olivia would always smile, sometimes shrug and say, "It's a long story, but a good one." Sometimes they retold it, about the girl who thought her brakes were failing and met a man who showed her what it meant to slow down, to trust, to build love one bolt and promise at a time. Sometimes they said nothing and just held each other as the fire crackled, content in the silence they had once been so afraid of. They never stopped choosing each other, not because it was always easy, but because it was always worth it. And every time Olivia glanced at that photo, the one where Brian had a smear of grease on his collar and she had tears caught in the corner of her smile, she remembered that love, real love, had never needed to be loud to be lasting. It had only needed to be honest. Sometimes love is not about grand gestures or perfect timing. Sometimes it is found in the quiet strength of someone who fixes more than just broken things. Someone who offers not just their hands, but their truth, their healing, and their whole heart. Brian and Olivia's story reminds us that real love is built, not bought. That trust, once broken, can still be mended. And that even the heaviest secrets, when shared with courage, can lead to the most beautiful beginnings. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to Soul-Stirring Stories, where we share powerful, emotional tales that remind us of the beauty in honesty, resilience, and love that doesn't need to shout to be heard. Subscribe now and let your heart be stirred, one story at a time.